As I lay in bed, the cold winter's night air seeped into my bones, but the warmth of the fireplace and the crackle of its logs helped to chase away the chill. Outside, the snow fell gently, casting a serene silence over the world. The soft glow of the Christmas lights that lined our street added a touch of festive cheer, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that had been growing within me all day. It started with small things: a faint whisper in my ear when no one was around, a shadowy figure darting out of the corner of my eye, or an inexplicable chill that ran down my spine whenever I thought about Christmas past. At first, I wrote it off as mere imagination, but as the night wore on and the shadows in my room began to twist and writhe like living things, I realized that something was very wrong. The flickering flames of the fireplace seemed to dance with a malevolent glee, casting eerie silhouettes on the walls. I felt a presence around me, watching me, waiting for me to drift off to sleep so it could begin its sinister work. As I tried to focus on the gentle rhythm of the snowfall outside, my mind began to wander back to the strange occurrences that had been plaguing me all day. It was as if the veil between reality and nightmare was growing thinner by the minute, and I knew that I was about to embark on a journey into the darker side of Christmas. I had always loved this old house, with its creaky wooden floorboards and worn armchairs that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. The fireplace crackled and spat, casting a warm golden light over the room, making it feel like a cozy little sanctuary from the cold winter's night outside. But as I settled into my favorite chair, surrounded by the soft glow of Christmas lights and the comforting scent of pine, I couldn't shake off the feeling of isolation that had been growing within me all day. Being alone on a cold winter's night was supposed to be a privilege, not a curse, but tonight it felt like a prison. The snow fell gently outside, muffled by the thick walls of our old house, and I felt like I was trapped in a world of my own making. My eyes wandered around the room, taking in the familiar comforts that usually brought me peace: the stack of books on the shelf, the vintage ornament collection on the mantel, the soft blanket draped over the back of the sofa. But tonight, they all seemed to mock me, their familiar faces twisted into cruel grins. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but it only seemed to highlight my own sense of disconnection. As I sat there, surrounded by the silence and darkness, I felt like I was waiting for something, or someone to come and join me in this cold, dark world. And then, just as I was starting to drift off into a fitful sleep, I heard it: the faintest creak of the floorboards, followed by the soft rustle of fabric. It sounded like someone was getting out of bed, coming to sit beside me and share in my solitude. But when I turned to look, there was no one there. As I drifted off to sleep, the shadows on the wall began to stir. At first, I dismissed them as mere trickery of the light, but soon I realized that something was amiss. The shadows seemed to be moving of their own accord, twisting and writhing like living things. I tried to focus on my breathing to calm myself down, but my eyes were drawn inexorably to the darkness. It started with a faint ripple, a tiny disturbance in the otherwise smooth surface of the wall. I watched as it grew, spreading across the room like a stain. The shadows seemed to be seeping into every corner, filling in the gaps and crevices where there was no light. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that the shadows were not just moving, they were also changing shape. They took on forms that I recognized from my childhood: twisted trees, ghostly faces, and dark, featureless shapes that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of their own. The room was filling up with them, an endless tide of darkness that threatened to engulf me whole. I tried to look away, but my eyes were glued to the shadows as they continued to grow and twist, like some sort of macabre dance. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went still. The shadows froze in place, their twisted forms holding steady for a moment before disappearing into nothingness. I was left sitting there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. But the silence was oppressive, heavy with unspoken menace. I knew that I had seen something that night, something that I couldn't explain or understand. And as I sat there, frozen with fear, I realized that I wasn't alone in the room. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining to pick up any sound that might explain the strange occurrences. And then I heard it, a faint whispering in my ear. It was soft and raspy, like the rustling of dry leaves or the hum of a distant engine. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the whispering grew louder, I realized that it was real. It was coming from outside my room, but it sounded like it was happening right next to me. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, mournful sigh that seemed to be speaking directly to my soul. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy and unresponsive. I was trapped in bed, unable to move or escape the creeping sense of dread that was spreading through my veins. The whispering grew louder still until it was almost a scream, and then suddenly it stopped. The silence was oppressive, like a physical presence that was pressing down on me. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for the whispering to start again. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my room. Heavy, deliberate steps, like someone was walking towards me with a sense of purpose. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that whatever was making those sounds was coming for me. As I lay there, frozen with fear, the footsteps outside my room grew louder and closer. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to move or speak as whatever was making those sounds approached my door. The creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet seemed to be getting closer and closer, until it finally stopped right outside my door. The figure on the other side of the door didn't say a word, but I could sense its presence like a palpable force. It was standing just out of sight, but I knew it was there, watching me with an unblinking gaze. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it might burst out of my chest at any moment. And then, in a movement that was both slow and sudden, the figure began to move towards the window. It didn't turn its back on me or leave the room. It simply walked over to the window and stood there, its presence filling the entire space. I felt like I was being swallowed up by some unseen force, like my very soul was being pulled out of my body and dragged across the floor. The figure didn't move again, but it seemed to be waiting for something or someone. And then, in a movement that was almost imperceptible, its head turned towards me. I felt a jolt of electricity run through my body as our eyes met, and I knew that I was staring into the face of something truly evil. The figure didn't smile or show any other emotion, but it seemed to be savoring the moment, like it had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it began to walk towards me. As the figure walked towards me, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. But then, something even more terrifying happened. The room around me began to fill with ghostly apparitions, their presence like a cold mist that seeped into my bones. At first, they were just faint shapes, but as I watched, they grew more defined until I could see the faces of people I had loved and lost. There was my mother, dressed in her favorite dress from when I was a child, her eyes black as coal. My father, with his kind smile and twinkling eyes, stood beside her, his presence warm and comforting. But as I watched, their faces began to twist and contort, like they were being pulled apart by some unseen force. And then there were the others, my grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, all dressed in festive attire, but with an unmistakable malevolent intent. They seemed to be drawn to me, their eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I tried to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The apparitions began to close in on me, their presence suffocating until I felt like I was drowning in a sea of ghostly faces. And then the figure at the window spoke, its voice low and raspy. "It's time to join us," it said. "Time to join our family." The apparitions surged forward, their faces twisted into grotesque grins as they reached out to claim me. As I was being surrounded by the ghostly apparitions, the figure at the window raised its hand, and everything went white. When my vision returned, I found myself transported to a series of memories from Christmases past. The first recollection that flashed before my eyes was of a childhood Christmas spent with my family. We were all smiling and laughing, gathered around the tree as we exchanged gifts. But as I watched, my father's face began to twist into a grotesque grin, revealing razor-sharp teeth. My mother's smile faltered, and she seemed to shrink away from him, her eyes filled with fear. The rest of the family seemed oblivious to the horror unfolding before them, but I felt a creeping sense of dread that made my skin crawl. Next, I saw a Christmas from a few years ago when my grandparents had come to visit. They were dressed in their finest attire, beaming with pride as they exchanged gifts. But as the evening wore on, their smiles began to warp and contort, revealing hints of something dark and sinister lurking beneath the surface. And then I saw a Christmas from just last year, when my friends had come over for a party. We were all laughing and having a great time, but as the night wore on, our faces began to change, our eyes turning black as coal, our smiles twisting into grotesque grins. It was as if we were being transformed into something monstrous, something that didn't want me anymore. Each recollection ended with a sense of despair and tragedy, like I had lost something precious and irreplaceable. The visions swirled around me, leaving me feeling disoriented and scared. I realized that the figure at the window was taking me on this journey to show me that Christmas had become a time for darkness and horror, rather than joy and love. As I continued to be bombarded with visions of Christmases past, the figure at the window began to warp and distort, its presence becoming increasingly menacing. The room around me seemed to shrink, trapping me in a maze of my own fears. Every step I took felt like I was walking further into a nightmare from which I might never awaken. The ghostly apparitions closed in on me, their faces twisted into grotesque grins as they whispered terrifying tales in my ear. "You'll never escape the horrors that haunt you," they cackled. "You'll never find peace." The figure at the window began to laugh, its voice like a cold wind blowing through the streets of winter. It was a sound that made my blood run cold, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I tried to run, but my legs were frozen in place, unable to move even if I wanted to escape. The apparitions began to close in on me, their faces blurring together into a twisted mass of horror. I felt like I was being consumed by my own fears, that they were devouring me from the inside out. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the figure at the window spoke again, its voice dripping with malice. "It's time to join us," it said. "Time to become one of us." The apparitions surged forward, their faces merging into a single, twisted visage that seemed to be made entirely of my own fears. I was trapped, unable to escape the horrors that haunted me. I was trapped in the figure's lair, surrounded by the ghostly apparitions that seemed to be made entirely of my own fears. The air was thick with an eerie, pulsating energy that seemed to vibrate through every cell in my body. I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze upon me, like a physical force that was pressing down on me. And then I heard the sound of footsteps, echoing through the room like the beat of a dark and malevolent heart. The apparitions began to move towards me, their faces twisted into grotesque grins as they converged on the figure at the center of the room. It was as if they were a single, unified entity, moving in perfect synchrony as they surrounded me with an aura of unspeakable horror. I tried to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat, unable to escape. The apparitions closed in on me, their ethereal forms seeming to blur and merge together as they reached out to claim me. I felt a cold, clammy hand grasp my ankle, pulling me down into the darkness below. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on a cold, stone floor, surrounded by the ghostly apparitions that seemed to be made entirely of my own fears. The figure at the center of the room stood over me, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly energy as it spoke in a voice that was like a cold wind blowing through the streets of winter. "Welcome to Midnight Massacre," it said. "A time for reckoning." As I looked around, I saw that I was not alone. A group of ghostly figures seemed to be gathered around me, their faces twisted into grotesque grins as they waited for something to happen. And then, I saw the ritual begin. The apparitions started to chant, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to draw me deeper into the depths of madness. The figure at the center of the room began to dance, its movements jerky and unnatural as it seemed to be driven by some dark and malevolent force. And I knew that I was trapped in a nightmare from which I might never awaken. For in this world, there was no escape from the horrors that haunted me, no escape from the Midnight Massacre. As the night wore on, I found myself questioning my own sanity. Was it all just a product of my fevered imagination? Was this really happening, or was it just some twisted dream that I couldn't wake up from? I looked around at the ghostly apparitions, the figure at the center of the room, and the ritual that seemed to be unfolding before me like a dark and twisted dance. And I wondered, what if this wasn't real? What if I was just trapped in some kind of waking nightmare, with no escape from the horrors that haunted me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my grip on reality begin to slip. I tried to focus on the present moment, to push aside the doubts and fears that were creeping into my mind. But it was no use. My imagination had taken hold, and I was powerless to stop it. I saw visions of myself walking through a dark and deserted street, with the ghostly apparitions closing in around me like a shroud. I saw myself trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror, with no escape from the horrors that haunted me. And I knew that I was descending into madness, lost in a world of my own fevered imagination. The last thing I remembered was the figure at the center of the room, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly energy as it spoke in a voice that was like a cold wind blowing through the streets of winter. "Welcome to your own private hell," it said. And then, everything went black. As I found myself trapped in the time loop, I realized that I was reliving the same terrifying moments over and over again. Every door I tried led to more corridors. Every window I looked out of showed only darkness and despair. The figure at the center of the room seemed to be laughing at me, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light as it watched me stumble through the never-ending cycle. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or escape. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan to break free from this living nightmare. But every time I thought I had found a way out, the loop would restart and I would find myself back at the beginning. It was as if I was stuck in some kind of infinite hell, reliving the same moments of terror over and over again. The apparitions seemed to be closing in on me, their ghostly forms growing more solid with every passing moment. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, making my skin crawl with fear. And then, Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the loop would restart and everything would begin all over again. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, reliving the same moments of terror until my mind snapped under the pressure. The figure at the center of the room seemed to be enjoying my suffering, its laughter echoing through the corridors as I stumbled through the never-ending cycle. And I knew that I would never escape, forever trapped in this living hell of fear and terror. I stumbled through the final loop, my mind numb and my body exhausted. The apparitions closed in around me, their ghostly forms growing more solid with every passing moment. And then, just when I thought it was all over, I saw it. A figure standing at the center of the room, its eyes blazing with an otherworldly energy. It was the one who had been guiding me through this twisted game, the one who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But as I looked into its eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A spark of recognition, a glimmer of familiarity. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. The figure wasn't me. It wasn't any of the people I had seen throughout this twisted game. It was something else. Something ancient and evil, something that had been awakened by the Christmas spirit. The realization sent a chill down my spine, and I knew that I had to get out of there fast. But it was too late. The figure began to speak, its voice like thunder in my mind. "You should have stayed dead," it said. And with that, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing with pain. The room was quiet and still, the only sound the soft hum of a Christmas carol playing in the background. I stumbled to my feet, looking around in confusion. Where was I? How did I get here? And then I saw it. A small note taped to the wall. "Merry Christmas," it said. "You'll never escape." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been played. I had been led into this twisted game by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And now I was trapped forever, stuck in this living nightmare of my own making.